Welcome to Activate Your Introvert, the podcast for entrepreneurs and business leaders to help unlock more productivity and creativity so you get a better business. Nobody likes being talked over, or at least nobody I've ever spoken to. And if you're the exception, please let me know. Now this goes for introverts, extroverts, and everybody in between. This week's episode is about getting your answer out and not being talked over. And it's especially relevant to introverts as we tend to pause and think before answering. I'll be asking Michael Dodd, author of Great Answers to Tough Questions at Work, for some comments later. But before we get into that, a quick advert. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitch, Spotify, or TuneIn. I'd also love your feedback on the show. Please go to the relevant stores. As ever, if you'd like to talk to me about issues raised in this podcast or others relating to introverts, please visit introvertinbusiness.co.uk. So, have you ever had that moment when you've got an answer and you just don't get the chance to get it out? The other person doesn't stop talking, talks over you, or even more commonly for introverts, doesn't let you get started. Let's come back to getting your words in a moment. But firstly, why is this more common for introverts? One of the defining points of an introvert is to process things internally. That's to say, we absorb something and consider it before talking about it. An extrovert processes externally. That means an extrovert will talk to think, where an introvert will think to talk. You may remember a few weeks ago, Adrienne Gibson, an extrovert, on the podcast was discussing the heart of change, saying how she will often make sense of things by verbalizing them, a literal case of someone who talks to think. This internal processing gap can leave some people to think introverts are slow because they don't immediately answer with a snappy but probably poorly thought through comment back. And as I said, that's all about this internal processing gap. And there's the other point to it. How frustrating can it be when you're thinking through an answer, you're about to give that answer because you've engaged with the questioner, but they never let you answer. And as the questioner, you've asked a question, what are you missing out by not getting that answer? There's an example that I can give from a presentation I was giving in London a few weeks ago.
So let's think of a few of them. And I'll tell you a very quick story which will highlight one or two of them. I used to work with somebody and a number of years ago, and he would ring me up every single week and he'd go, "John, great to speak to you. I'm just ringing you up because I haven't spoken to you for ages. How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing really well, thank you." Note the holding statement there. That's a little trick, because actually what I'm doing is processing the answer. So I've just got a holding statement. "I'm doing really well, thank you." Take a breath. "Oh, that's really great, because in the last week I've signed up 15 new clients, I've done this, I met the MP for so-and-so, I've done..." To the extent where I was absolutely convinced, because he carried on for 5 minutes, that he had a little hole inserted in the bottom of his lungs, so that air could come in there and he didn't have to breathe. But the point was, he'd get to the end of that and say, "Anyway, enough about me, how about you?" "Well, I've had a really good week and..." "Oh, fantastic!" And then he'd repeat the whole thing again. Until he got to the end and he'd say, "I've got to go now." What do we learn from that other than he had a big ego?
So, introverts, yep, we are our own worst enemy. We let the other person answer for us quite often, and sometimes we can shrug our shoulders and let it happen. Let's talk about a solution to that in a moment, and then test that solution with communications expert Michael Dodd. For that, a recommendation to extrovert team leaders who want their team to engage with them. Stop Sit on your hands. Zip it. Give the introvert the gift of time. And then, of course, the introvert. What can you do to get your answer in that gap? That's quite hard because your natural tendency is to stop and think for a moment, completely think through your answer, and then give an answer. But in this case, I want you to think about something different. Post. P-O-S-T. P for pause. You're going to pause anyway because you're internally processing, but make the pause consciously a lot shorter than normal. O for open. S for statement. Come up with an opening statement that's going to buy you some time. Something like, "That's great, I've just been working on some ideas about that." Or something like, "Fantastic question, I had an answer on that just the other day when I was asked something very similar, and the whole group thought that it was the best answer I'd ever given." And of course that's bound to give you a chance to wait until you can do the final part. Think. Now think about your answer. Compose it in the way that you would as an introvert, only this time you've given yourself some more time to give that response. I think that's a great time to bring in Michael Dodd. Welcome, Michael. I know that you've got an amazing formula for answering tough questions, which presumably means giving a good answer and the one that you want heard. Just before we do that, we were talking earlier about this problem that lots of introverts have, where they will get asked a question by an extrovert, and by the time they've thought of the answer, the extrovert's answered it for them. What kind of holding statements would work well to allow the introvert to say something while they think about their answer?
I think the first thing that they need to do is to indicate they do have a real interest and some potentially valuable thoughts on the topic. So it could be something like, "I've been giving a lot of thought to that point, and there's several things that I actually would like to share with you." A shy introvert, or someone who is perceived as a shy introvert, might be interpreted, if they just say, "Let me think," as not wanting to contribute. So I would say, suggest your enthusiasm to make some kind of a contribution. The second thing, which applies to all questions you could be asked, but particularly the tough ones that you mentioned early on, and that is, what I strongly recommend to people is to do their thinking on important, likely topics in advance.
Which fits introverts perfectly.
Yes, because they are thinkers and analyzers. And so what they would be doing if they took my recommendation before, say, a networking meeting, is make sure they've got their answer to the obvious questions like, "What do you do?" or "How's business in this current environment?" or things like that, where they could be asked about it in the conversation, so that they've got at least the essence of potential answers at the top of their mind. If there's a hot topic is coming up, then you've got your thoughts about it, particularly from your own perspective, where professionally people might challenge you on it. For example, there's always changes in tax laws going on. And if you're an accountant, for example, who are often, but not all, introverts, you may well be expected, if you go to that networking meeting, to be asked something about what your take is on the government's latest tax changes, and are accountants doing enough to prepare for the new situation? And so you want to be ready to be on the front foot and have your "here's one I prepared earlier" answer ready to put before the questioner, and typically at a networking meeting, a wider audience of other people gathered around.
Love it. You have a formula for answering tough questions?
Yeah, I'll give you the very short version of it. It's ABC, and A stands for, amazingly enough, answer the question. If you can't answer the question, and there can be good reasons why, maybe because you don't know the answer and your team is working on finding the answer, or because the answer involves client confidentiality, then A stands for acknowledge. So you might say, "Unfortunately, I'm not able to answer the question because." The important thing is to give a very brief reason as to why you can't answer the question. Whatever you do from there, whether you answer the question straight up or explain why you can't answer it or won't answer it, the thing is you don't just leave it there. You go on to B, which stands for bridge, which is a little formula of words which allows you to shift things on. It could be something like, what's really important is, or a really important aspect of your question is. And so you're just going to deal with perhaps a fragment of the wider question, or say something important. And in that point, you've got a license under the normal rules of conversation to do that because you have already been upfront and given the answer or said why you can't or won't. So what do you bridge onto? You bridge onto your message. C stands for the content of your message, and it's your message on that topic that they're asking about. And they want your take on it, often your professional take on it. So your message is something which relates very much to the question and is typically a win-win message, which is in the interests of your audience to hear it, as well as typically being in your interests to give it out. And that's very satisfactory communication if you can hit that win-win point. So answer, bridge onto the content of your message. And if time permits and you've got one, it's very good then to move on and give an example of what you're talking about. So you're painting a picture in the minds of the questioner and everyone else so they can actually see what you mean. So if they're asking a question about your business and how you solve a particular problem for your clients, you want to be finishing on that success story where someone had that same problem, and because your company is good at what you do, you actually show what the outcome was in a way that your audience can actually see it. And the good thing about that is not only are you giving them something useful and something memorable, but the next question after it is often likely to be a very positive one, like, well, if we entered into a contractual arrangement, would you be able to do that for our company? And that's the kind of question a lot of people at business networking meetings want to hear.
Really short time there, Michael. So very quickly, ABC. So acknowledge your answer, bridge onto the content of what you really want to say, and if you can, put an example in there too. Thank you, Michael. How can listeners get back in touch with you if they wanted to ask you more?
The best thing is by email, Michael, Michael, at Michael Dodd, D-O-D-D, communications, with an S on the end, .com.
Fantastic. Thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Great talking with you, John.
Thank you for listening to Activate Your Introvert, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'd love to see your reviews on the iTunes store. Thank you once again, and catch up with you next week.